Hi everyone, I'm Michael Marshall and I'm a science writer. My stories have been published in magazines like New Scientist and on the BBC. And today I'm going to talk to you about something really important that happened on our planet a very, very long time ago. See, I'm also the author of a new book called The Genesis Quest, and this is about one of the biggest mysteries in science. How did life begin? How did the first living organisms on our planet come into existence? And the origin of life is a really hard problem to solve. And partly that's because it's just really difficult for us to imagine what our planet would be like without life. Because, whenever we look around, there's life everywhere. There's dogs and cats and pigeons and spiders and worms and fish and trees and flowers and all kinds of other wonderful things. And also, even though we can't see them, there are also millions upon millions of tiny living organisms that we can't see using our eyes, but which we can see if we look under a microscope because they're so small. So it's difficult for us to imagine a planet Earth that doesn't have life everywhere. The other reason that it's hard to understand how life on Earth began is that it happened so long ago. Now, we don't know exactly when it happened, but for reasons that I'm going to get to, we know that it must have been at least 3.5 billion years ago. And that is just a huge and ridiculous number. It's really difficult to get your head around what 3.5 billion years could possibly mean. We come across this a lot in science when we're thinking about the history of the Earth or about the scale of the universe, that we just hit these ridiculously enormous numbers that our minds can't quite grasp. So what I thought I'd do today is try and help you to imagine just how long ago it was that the first life emerged on Earth. What we're going to do is we're going to pretend that we have a time machine. Unfortunately we don't, but we're going to pretend. And what we're going to do is we're going to imagine what it would be like to jump back in time a bit at a time. And each jump is going to be bigger than the one before. And specifically, each jump in time is going to be 10 times bigger than the one before. And we're going to see how many jumps it takes us to get all the way back to the first life. So we're starting from September 2020. So our first jump, we're just going to go back 1 year to September 2019, last year. The Earth looks pretty much like it does today. The one big difference we'd all notice is that the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 wasn't spreading yet, so we didn't have to do any of that nasty social distancing that we do now. So for our second jump, we're going to go back 10 times far, 10 years, so we're going to go back to 2010. It's possible that some of the people watching this video, depending on how old you were, might not have been born yet in 2010. It was a busy and eventful year. One thing that happened was that astronomers discovered a new asteroid, a great big ball of rock in our solar system, which they later named Rosa Parks, after the famous American civil rights activist. Now, for our next jump, we're going to go 10 times 10, so 100 years ago. That takes us to the year 1920. If you went to the cinema in the year 1920, the characters in the films wouldn't talk. And that's because talking pictures hadn't actually been invented yet. There also weren't any mobile phones, there weren't any computers, and there was most definitely no space flight. For our fourth jump, we're going to go back 1,000 years. And that takes us to the year 1020. This was the time when the Vikings were attacking England a lot, and so in fact, in the year 2020, England was ruled by a Danish king called Canute. And meanwhile, in the Americas, a culture called the Hohokam had built enormous networks of canals, some of which are still around even today. For our next jump, we're going to go back 10,000 years. That would take us to around about 8000 BC, but it's not actually worth giving a precise year. And that's because we're now so far back in history that there isn't, that we're before the invention of writing. So there's no written history of this time. We're so far back that we're before all of the ancient societies that you might have heard about. So we're a long time before the Roman Empire, we're before the ancient Greeks, and we're even before the pyramids of Egypt. For our next jump, we're going to go 100,000 years. And now things look a little bit different. So the first thing to note is that there aren't that many humans living on Earth at this time. We don't know how many, but it may have only been a few thousand of us. And what's more, we weren't the only human species alive at that time. There were several other groups. The most famous one was the Neanderthals, who looked and behaved an awful lot like us. They were very slightly different. Their faces were a slightly different shape, and their arms and legs were perhaps not quite as long as ours, but you would still really struggle to tell the difference between a human and a Neanderthal. And our ancestors lived alongside them, or at least shared the planet with them, for many thousands of years until the Neanderthals eventually died out. Now we're going to take our 7th jump, and this takes us back 1 million years. And now there aren't any humans like us at all, because our species, Homo sapiens, hasn't evolved yet. There are other older groups of humans around. Think groups like Homo erectus, who were quite different to us in both the way they looked and the way that they behaved, and which don't exist anymore. They shared the planet with all kinds of strange and wonderful creatures, which again have since gone extinct. Things like saber-toothed cats and woolly mammoths. Our next jump goes back 10 million years, and now there aren't any human-like creatures at all, because the whole group of animals that we belong to hasn't evolved yet. Instead, there are an awful lot of different kinds of apes. The other thing is that if you were to see the Earth from space around 10 million years ago, you might notice that it looked just a little bit different. You might think that some of the continents, the big land masses like Africa and Europe, aren't quite exactly where you would think that they would be. And that's because they're all moving around very slowly on Earth's surface over time. And so if you go back far enough, the arrangement of the continents is very slightly different. Now, for our next jump, we're going back 100 million years, and now you absolutely will notice the difference. The continents are definitely in very different places, and some of them are even slightly different shapes. Now, 100 million years ago is the time when Earth was dominated by everyone's favourite, the dinosaurs. So you might, for instance, have seen a Spinosaurus, which was a huge predatory dinosaur, even bigger than Tyrannosaurus rex, which had a great big sail on its back. Now, for our 10th jump, we are going back 1 billion years. And at this point, the Earth is unrecognisable. We aren't actually sure exactly where the continents were or even what shapes they were. The other thing that you would notice if you went back to this time is that there weren't any animals or plants that you would recognise. None of those things had evolved yet. There was a lot of life, but it was all the tiny kinds of life that we've talked about before, so the things that you can't really see with just your eyes and which you need a microscope to be able to see properly. Now, in theory, we could now go back 10 billion years, but I think we shouldn't do that. And that's because if we went back 10 billion years, we'd find that there wasn't a planet. The reason for that is that Earth only formed 4.5 billion years ago. So if we go back before that, we just find ourselves Earthless. What's more, the entire rest of the solar system, so the Sun and all the other planets, would also not have been around because they formed about the same time as the Earth. So instead of going back 10 billion years and finding nothing, let's go back instead for a slightly smaller jump, although it's still, as you perhaps gathered by now, absolutely enormous. And we're going to go back 3.5 billion years. So this is the number that I mentioned earlier. 3.5 billion years, we're choosing that because that is the time when we have the oldest hard evidence that there was life on Earth. So there are fossils which were found in a place called Pilbara in Western Australia. And these are fossils, again, of these single-celled microscopic living organisms, which lived in thin layers, a bit like mats, and those got covered over by soil or something like it. Now, scientists have tried really hard to find older evidence of life, but it's been really difficult, and there isn't anything yet that everyone agrees is definitely real. The problem is that there are just so few rocks that have been preserved from that time, rocks that might carry traces of life. As I said earlier, because the rocks of Earth's surface are moving around so much, and it's been such a long time, pretty much all of the rocks from that sort of time period have had something bad happen to them. Maybe they've been heated up, or they might have been squashed and crushed, or both. And all those things will have messed up whatever evidence of life might once have been preserved in those rocks. So all that we can really say for sure is that life began sometime between 4.5 billion years ago, when the planet formed, and 3.5 billion years ago when we have the oldest fossils. And we can't really be more specific than that. As to exactly how life formed, well, it is a huge and complicated puzzle. We don't know for sure how it happened, and there's still a lot of disagreement among scientists, but we do have some really good, promising ideas about it, and if you read the Genesis Quest, it will take you through all of them and hopefully explain them to you. Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.